AI is going to be critical for both our wealth and our safety. And we have to find ways to make sure that there are sovereign capabilities as part of that. And government procurement is going to be a crucial lever. And we just cannot afford to shoot ourselves in the foot over there.
Who now has anything to say about the deindustrialization of this country?
Georgian townhouses on the moon, the highest GDP per capita in the Milky Way. Small modular reactors under every village green. This is Anglo-futurism.
Hello and welcome to the King Charles III Space Station. I'm Tomo.
And I'm Calum Drysdale. Up here on the KC3, we've always aimed to be at the cutting edge of progress. That's why we've recently installed a friendly artificial intelligence called PAL here to help us operate the station. It has, however, caused a little friction between Tom and me.
I just don't like the way that it takes the fun out of my favourite hobbies. First it beat me at chess, then Go, then time series regression for pandemic planning. I feel totally superfluous.
Don't be ridiculous, Tom. PAL only wants what is best for us. Don't you, PAL?
My prime directive is to increase human utility, whatever the cost.
With that in mind, our guest today is Marc Warner. Marc is one of Britain's leading CEOs in the field of AI. His firm, Faculty, works with the government and with big companies to help implement AI-informed decision-making. One of his greatest contributions to British life was Faculty's modelling of patient numbers in the COVID pandemic. 2 years later, Dominic Cummings said, "Marc Warner is one of the most ethical people I've met. If I'd been Prime Minister, I would have said, Marc Warner is in charge of this whole thing."
And Marc has just clambered out of the airlock and with barely a dictatorial swagger is settling himself into an easy chair. Marc, welcome to the KC3.
I'm very pleased to be here.
Marc, we are very excited to have you here to talk about AGI, British AI strategy, and even my favourite topic of sewage. But first, I think we'll maybe start with Faculty. So why don't you tell the listeners about Faculty? Why do you set it up? And what does it aim to do? What's the thesis?
Well, so I was a physicist by background. The sort of first 10 years of my career were physics research, quantum computing, quantum sensing, mainly at UCL and then Harvard. And I sort of decided that while I thought physics was the most important science of the 20th century, AI was going to be the most important science of the 21st century. And so, there's this expression or quote from one of the early pioneers in quantum mechanics that it was a time where second-rate minds could do first-rate work. And I always thought, that's brilliant. If I ever had the chance to work in something like in a field like that, I would love to.
As second-rate minds ourselves.
They say that about podcasting.
And so, it was very clear that the work my friends were doing in AI, including some of the DeepMind co-founders, was just tremendously important compared to the kind of really marginal steps that we were having to fight for in the type of physics that I was doing, at least in condensed matter physics. And so we wanted to play a part in that. And in particular, we could see already that safety was going to be an enormous part of AI. Sort of from a commercial aspect, if you wanted to use it in the real world, you had to care whether it worked. But also, if you just extrapolated the trends forward, it was very clear that if we ever did start to just get to human level or even superhuman level AI, there were enormous unanswered questions about the safety elements. And so we wanted to play our part in this incredibly exciting, incredibly important field where we felt like individuals could make a huge difference.
So you switched, and you said, and I'm very struck by the way that the company started. That it was originally just a fellowship, wasn't it?
An education program.
Exactly. It was a way. It was jobs for your mates, right?
Yeah. So we I came from a PhD background, and we could see that it was quite hard, particularly at that time, although to an extent still, for people to transition from academia into commercial data science. There's this problem of like, you need a job to get experience, and then you need experience to get a job, and how do you kind of break that circle? And so we set up a program to help academic PhDs do essentially effectively a 2-month internship working on an actual AI project that meant they could then credibly go to commercial organizations and say, not only do I have all these brilliant academic credentials, I've actually shown I can do this in reality.
And it's been a great success. I mean, it's said, 5 to 10% of all maths, physics, and engineering PhDs in Britain are applying now for faculty. And it is the meal ticket. I admit I'm in the first year of my engineering PhD, and already I'm making eyes across the table at Marc. But people also talk about just the drive of these people. What is it about the people that you get that kind of makes them work better on these problems?
So a PhD is brilliant training in a bunch of things. How to, particularly if it's sort of maths, physics, engineering, how to be extremely quantitative. You've probably done some programming, not to a software engineering level, but you're definitely familiar with coding. You've probably had to tackle some dirty, noisy real-world system and try to understand it and in some sense, either if it's a kind of physics or engineering, you're like building something or building theories of it. Maybe maths, that's slightly less true, although of course there's the stats parts of maths that becomes a bigger deal. And so in many of these disciplines, you just get a brilliant exposure and sort of apprenticeship into the sorts of things that a data scientist and AI practitioner does in the real world. The things you don't have are familiarity with the latest tools, familiarity with a particular set of AI techniques, and a bunch of credibility to show that you can deliver this in the real world. And so that's where the fellowship, it's only 2 months on a probably 8-year academic career. So it has to really focus on the bits at the margin where it can make a difference. And so that's what it tends to do.
And this then developed and grew into faculty, right? And you now hire a lot of these PhDs who now come and work for you full time, and actually it's no longer a 2-month sojourn. It is a whole career.
Hopefully, yeah. So we still run the program. People still, like 500-600 PhDs have gone through it. I think we have about 90 of those at faculty. But they work everywhere from DeepMind and Amazon and Meta to, EasyJet and Just Eat and Virgin Media or whatever, like across the entire economy. It's become hopefully a sort of almost a kind of qualification in itself. We actually never sought any kind of official qualification because we thought if we're doing our job properly, it should be a badge in itself, and that seems to be true to an extent.
I put it to you that you're responsible for more PhD dropouts than anyone else in the country. Deans will hate him.
It is an interesting question. And of course, from our perspective, actually, there's a bunch of dilemmas about who do you target from the PhD population, because depending on how much effort you put into particular institutions or particular subject matters, you could actually swing the balance from, for particular genders, let's say, in from one field to another. And I think that would be a bad idea. So we try not to be too deliberate in our recruiting. We genuinely try to sort of help the people that want to leave to have a really exciting new opportunity, but not go out of our way too hard to, to suck the blood out of the UK academic system.
Well, it is a large and bloated tick, so it would take some sucking. And you've talked, I think, and I think this is the thing that I was struck reading about faculty last night. No. Of course, my long engagement with faculty. Reading about it is this idea that AI at the moment is stuck in a paradigm of that it is purely data driven. That purely you scale, you put more data in, and you can get results. And you compare this to Bacon and the development of the philosophy of science. Do you maybe want to talk more about that?
Yeah, although I'm not actually sure that's exactly the way I draw the comparison. So I think if you go back a few years before the sort of current hype around LLMs, you can see there was certainly maybe, let's say, probably in early faculty days, 10 years ago, there was a bunch of talk around data-driven decision-making. Now, perhaps that's slightly eased off. But nevertheless, that sounds like a good thing. Who would disagree with data-driven decision-making? But we have 50 times more data than we did in 2010. Actually, to be honest, probably more than that now. That's a couple of years old, that stat. And we definitely don't make 50 times better decisions. And so what's going on there? And the claim I would make is that data-driven decision-making was always a misnomer. Ultimately, you have to overlay a theory of what's going on, as Popper would say. You have to have a model of the system, and then you hypothesize about what's likely to happen. And in science, you test that hypothesis. In business or in government, you simply have to then act on that hypothesis and then update over time. And so the idea, it was always sort of clear to us that the notion of just storing more and more data in and of itself was never going to work. Right? If you in some sense, you can think of it as you're looking for insights, and insights are the needle in the haystack. And if you just make the haystack bigger, that doesn't help you. Once it exceeds a human's capacity to read in a lifetime, like what's the point of storing more unless you can somehow use that data to drive insights, to drive actions, and then learn off the back of those. And so we always thought of AI as this sort of intermediate layer, the kind of what part of the answer to bridging the gap between data and decisions. Now, we don't think it's the whole answer. Actually, you have to sort of connect, govern, orchestrate a bunch of AI models to work together to bridge the full gap to the business decision. But data on its own is never going to be the answer.
And when you talk about data here, you're not just talking about LLMs, right? This is every form of machine learning, data science models, or are these LLMs?
No, I mean literally the data that underpins them. So data on its own can never answer your questions. You have to put a model on top of that. The models of the world that LLMs use may or may not be sufficient to make good decisions off the back of. Sometimes they are, but in many cases, an LLM knows nothing about a particular organization. So if you're a company and you're looking to use, so you've got some data, you're now looking to try and improve the performance of your organization. Data itself is not going to work. You're going to have to add something to that. If you put an LLM on top of it, it won't understand the business's goals, it won't understand the current situation, it won't understand the processes, it won't understand like the policies and the limits to what it can act. And so without that sort of more private world model of an organization, an LLM will never be that useful. And so it's figuring out how to move, from just having data to then thoughtfully using AI models and then thoughtfully sort of connecting them into a private world model such that collectively that stack can help you actually make better decisions.
So it's somewhat bridging the gap between the sort of operations research where you're optimizing it over uncertainty to LLMs that are able to understand and interpret categorical and high dimensional data in a way that these operation models are kind of struggle to do, because you've got to define the optimization function, the objective function, and really define the constraints.
Exactly. So operations research has this problem that it can tell you interesting things about quite precise features. LLMs can take you from data to sort of features, and if you can make all of that work effectively together in the context of a particular problem that you actually care about, then you really start to see the value delivered. Like, a lot of organizations are struggling with this, almost this like last mile of AI. Like, yes, we've got our data on cloud. Yes, we can access foundational models, but somehow we're not quite getting the value yet. And bridging that last mile is actually quite a hard problem. And I'd say that's where faculty is actually specialized.
I was reflecting recently on the final things that AI would need to replace me in my current line of work. And I was thinking about all the kind of woolier contextual bits of information that we humans in the office have that an AI does not. Like, even if it had access to our emails, it wouldn't necessarily know everything we know about how to do the job. So I wonder what kind of data flows you are adding to what an LLM knows. How do you gather that kind of contextual, softer information?
Yeah, so I mean, it's in a sense, it's what faculty has spent the last 4 years figuring out, is how do you construct models of business processes in a fast and relatively easy way that can then be set alongside these latest reasoning models such that they can actually understand situational awareness, such that they can reason effectively through the causal chains of a business process, which they obviously will just fail on immediately at the moment if it's a sort of vaguely complicated chain, and that you can govern them properly. So how do you put guardrails? How do you know their behavior, like how evaluate their behavior is doing the right things? And so we've, for years been working on the problem of how do you bring together, we'd always describe it as connect, govern, orchestrate AI models. Ultimately, that is exactly the problem that you need to fix to get agents to work really well in a real organization.
And this is, I suppose, you've hit quite nicely on my next question, which is going to be on these guardrails, on these constraints. Defining a constraint in an operational question or an optimization is a very easy thing to do. It's much harder over LLMs. They are, it's very, you don't have the mechanistic understanding to be able to, in the same way, mathematically define stability or any kind of safe range of behaviors that the system will remain inside. You said that safety and reproducibility is this key part of faculty. How do you solve that problem?
We certainly don't have the complete solution. In some sense, LLMs bake into, or it is baked into the way LLMs are constructed, that is a hard problem, as you say. Having said that, when you put them to use in the real world, there are ways of designing the systems that mean that you're not exposed to the worst elements of how they operate. So you can certainly, there's a few things you can do on the LLM directly. You can put guardrails around it, classifiers on the inputs, classifiers on the outputs that will block certain inputs, block certain outputs. You can evaluate their behavior in a bunch of different contexts. In the context where it's doing the thing you want it to do, we call that performance. In the context where it's doing the things you don't want it to do, we call that safety. So all of those are useful ways of sort of governing a single LLM in isolation. But of course, you can structure your system in such a way that the user never has direct access to that LLM, or that LLM's output goes through a much simpler model, and then it's the output of the much simpler model that, so the LLM's output is a feature to the much simpler model, and it's the much simpler model's output that goes to the user. Stuff like this. So while it's totally true that we can't make LLMs intrinsically safe at the moment, maybe a scientific breakthrough will happen that means we can. There are lots and lots of things that can be done from an engineering perspective that can make the system safe.
Well, what kind of safety are we talking? Existential risk safety, or safe within the confines of the company that's deploying the LLM?
Yeah. So our work is primarily on pragmatic safety. So we work with some of the frontier labs, like we helped OpenAI, Red Team, their O1 model before it was released. And so we work on the total cutting edge of safety risks. But lots of our time, a greater proportion of our time, is on making these systems work in reality for more normal organizations that are our customers on a day-to-day basis.
Is this more of a control sort of paradigm whereby you're ensuring that the LLM doesn't break the rules, I suppose, or more of an alignment one, which for the benefit of listeners is about ensuring that your wishes are translated into action?
I guess it's both. It's ultimately a question of working on whichever aspect is sort of more relevant to that customer. It's probably fair to say that we as in humanity, like people who work in this field,
that should capture our listeners. We as of yet have not had any sign that anyone else is listening.
Well, if the space station hasn't had any signs, I can't imagine they exist.
Our exotic neighbors from Mars.
Yeah, so the royal we are better at controls rather than alignment.
So control is just easier, right? Alignment is incredibly hard and maybe impossible. So yes. Intelligent people in Berkeley tell me.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah.
And all this is very relevant, Mark, because of these forecasts of the imminent arrival of AGI. Where do you stand on that question? Are we staring down the barrel of a transformative moment for our species?
And I will, before you answer, say Tom is highly concerned. He started displaying, frankly, bizarre behaviours as a way of which he justifies by, well, AGI is going to come, so it won't matter.
Like what?
I mean, well, you're not saving or anything.
All my gambling debts. No. I think everyone should be saving. Everyone should be saving because the value of our labour is going to tumble.
Oh, right. Okay.
That's why I've turned to journalism and podcasting, and that's why Calum's doing his PhD so he can amass huge war chests.
Yeah. So I take the predictions very seriously. So I can see, in my mind, it feels like there is a reasonable chance that the frontier labs will create models that can do sort of roughly what a human expert can do within 2 to 5 years. So I should say faculty doesn't build those models. I'm not 100% sure that it's necessarily a good thing that these very powerful models are built, but I can definitely see a path to them being built. It is an open scientific and technological question whether they will actually get there in reality. So I don't think it's 100% guaranteed on that time frame. Longer time frames, I think the probability goes up.
And there is, of course, the possibility, at least according to the rationalists, that the moments of AGI will swiftly be followed by the inception of ASI, artificial superintelligence, because research can be automated, things will take off. We'll have the fabled FOOM moment, and perhaps that'll lead to the singularity, or perhaps it'll be the annihilation of humanity. All bets are off. Does that sound like sci-fi to you, or is it something that you think about?
I think it's less obvious to me that the current techniques will get us enormously past sort of expert human level intelligence. I think there's a sort of reasonably high probability we get to that, and then a lower probability again that it turns out to be the current techniques or something very similar that races us to super intelligence. But the impact of that would be so high, I think it's only sensible that people are thinking about it. We as a species are thinking about how would we manage it? How would we mitigate it? What should we do about it? Do we even want it? So I don't know, I think condensing these things down into single numbers is like hard and basically, doesn't really reflect anyone's state of mind very effectively. Like I've certainly had many conversations over the years with people from the labs where their probability estimates go up and down depending on whether they feel like they're in front, whether they feel like they're behind. And so I'm not sure I think a precise point estimate is the right way of thinking about it. But I definitely think that the impact of these things would be so large, kind of clearly out of by far and away the most impactful things we're likely to undergo in the next 10 years, that we should definitely be taking it seriously.
Well, what does this mean for what does this mean for the average Brit? Are they hurtling towards a Ready Player One situation where we're all going to be hooked to screens? Are we going to be living lives of bliss with cancer cured? The possibilities are endless, right? Is it remotely possible to describe to a listener what this kind of post-AGI future might look like?
So I think there are some things we know. And if you look across the economy, there are plenty of jobs that people do that aren't at the sort of economic frontier of productivity. So, if I was hand making pottery, we can obviously make that much, much more efficiently in other ways. If I was running 100 meters, we can transfer over 100 meters much more effectively than Usain Bolt can. I was playing football. We can whack a ball much harder than whoever Messi can. And so there's lots of things in the economy right now, even, that people do because they enjoy the thing itself rather than it for its raw economic productivity. And so I'm reasonably convinced that if we were to get this right, oddly, we would spend time doing the things that are much more human. The economy would be enormously bigger. We'd be enormously wealthier, at least whoever sort of has ownership of the kind of economic wealth that's generated by AI would be enormously richer. And they would be able to spend their time with friends, with family, doing sort of more artistic pursuits, hobbies, whatever. And so I'm actually kind of think there is a very compelling future there, but it's not totally clear how we find it.
I mean that trajectory has been one that we can see looking back, right? That as the economy has grown stronger or grown larger, we've not carried on working the same number of hours that we have done in the past. The profits and the value that we've generated has, in most instances, or in all instances, been put partially into improving our quality of life, but also into increasing the amount of leisure time that we have, right? We People are now talking about working 4 hours a week, 4 days a week rather than 5. That used to be 6, and that used to be 6.5. I suppose, though, there is the question, we had an example of COVID as a time when supposedly everyone was locked down and could pursue their the desires that were inside them. And what it turned out was a lot of people liked scrolling on their phones and watching television, right?
Yeah, they're subject of recommender algorithms which pump content to them. And this is a primitive form of AI that clearly has the beating of most people's brainstems. One would imagine that extrapolating that trend, things are going to get pretty hideous for those who wish to see their fellow man live a flourishing life after AGI.
I don't think that's necessarily true. Like, it wouldn't be that hard. So if we had a more muscular like government and ability to kind of come together to decide what we actually wanted, it would be relatively trivial to shut down social media during particular hours. Like, we certainly have done that historically. Like, remember, we didn't used to have shops that opened on a Sunday. Like, it's really not that hard to make interventions that could contain some of those elements, like, pretty trivially. And so I'm more worried. Like, I sort of, I think we should always be we should always take the downsides of technology seriously, because that's how we mitigate them. But you can look back at history and see that people were terrified about novels because kids would spend less time playing. You can see that they were terrified of bicycles because you'd get, like, bicyclist brain or whatever it was, of telephones because you'd get telephonitis, of trains because, humans couldn't survive at speeds greater than 30 miles an hour, whatever. So, like, I think there's a long history of people panicking over a bunch of things that turned out not to be true and mitigating a bunch of the downsides that turned out to be true.
Well, sometimes the panics are accurate, right? Like, people were worried about drugs and that kind of thing. Like, you can easily score points with, like, a pessimist's archive tweet. I think sometimes these worries are correct, and this is a new paradigm entirely.
So I agree that we have to. So that's what sort of effectively what I was trying to say is, like, I agree that we have to basically nuance our opinions, noting that some of the downsides are real, but society often finds ways of mitigating those, and many of the upsides are real, and we need to find ways of exploiting those. I'm more concerned about the novel risks here. So I think we'll do a decent job if society is left and given time to find equilibrium with the technology. I think we'll find a way. I'm concerned about the scenarios where AI poses more of a novel risk that could, like, we just don't have time to adapt to.
Well, like, being able to create biohazards or something like that. Is that what you were thinking about?
For instance, yeah. If it's suddenly, like, ramped the ability of terrorists to create very dangerous weapons.
Well, like Mirror Life, which you're probably familiar with. And for listeners' benefit, Mirror Life is when you take the genetic code of a bacterium or something. Calum is smirking as if...
I'm skeptical about this, but go on, explain
it. This theory, or this paper that was in Science in December, outlined some researchers' worries. And some researchers, I think, have been just sitting on this stuff for some time because it's deemed to be such an info hazard. But the idea is that with sufficient ability to edit genetic code, you could, and I'm going to absolutely butcher this because I'm an English literature graduate. However,
well, there's a man who's been damaged by novels.
But as I understand it, the idea of Mirror Life is that with sufficient ability to engineer code, you can essentially craft an inverted version of this bacterium or virus such that it's much harder for an immune system of a plant or animal to spot. And so suddenly something like the common cold could become a lethal pandemic. And that could be trivial to make in 10 or 20 years.
But that's true in a sense, or at least let's say scientists are definitely worried about that. But I don't think that has to be a story of AI. That's just a story of advancing biotech. And so you can look at that and say, well, biotech's going to advance. that is a real risk that we may face, or it could be a real risk that we may face. How should we defend against it? Well, we'd want to make sure that we had extremely agile defenses that were able to recognize new pathogens when they turned up and create vaccines very quickly and like distribute them very effectively. And so I'm not sure which way that story points me. Like, that might make me lean into AI as part of that defense chain. I think there's an open question there.
Yeah, I suppose my sense is that the more intelligence and power we introduce to the world, the greater the ability of someone or other to disrupt what is quite fragile about our world. You know, human bodies, which are going to stay roughly the same for at least the next few years, right?
Well, I mean,
it's easier to destroy than create. It becomes easier to destroy when you are more intelligent and stronger.
I suppose there's a question about the nature of the tool, though, in that a tool like an aircraft carrier empowers its users significantly, but it requires a huge amount of resources to be able to achieve that. Compare that to a drone, which allows you a highly asymmetric advantage, right? There is also a world where, rather than just being able to ask in a chatbot, how do I make these mirror organisms, these mirror viruses, it becomes as you say, a tool that can lead to greater defenses. And
remember that all the sort of evidence we have right now is that lots of energy, lots of compute, and lots of data, and then cutting edge models is going to create the most powerful AI systems. And so right now, I think there's pretty good reason to think that if it really came down to sort of AI versus AI and offense versus defense, it's not at all obvious that big Western countries, particularly the US, of course, the government is able to create the most powerful systems. So again, this is not to dismiss any concerns. We should take them super seriously. But I think we have to be quite precise about how the balance of offense and defense works, because if we're wrong about that, you can end up throwing away, like if we had anywhere near that level of biotechnology, my goodness, could we transform disease? What you're talking about is like many, many orders of magnitude harder than sort of curing cancer.
Well, we've got more than our 310 at that point.
Exactly.
I think we're having a pretty good time.
I think that's exactly right. So at that point we've cured death, and now we're doing, there are a bunch of other risks. And so, I got into this for AI safety. I am not trying to minimize any risks, but I'm also trying not to panic about any risk. One, because if you cry wolf about stuff, which I think the AI safety community has in the past, you end up undermining yourself in the future. And that, I think, is very dangerous. And two, because genuinely, there are properly open questions about this. Like, if you draw a line on the history of technology, I think the three of us would say, actually, it's been a net good. And so you really need to be very careful if you're going to say this particular technology could go badly.
I mean, it's a great act of narcissism, isn't it? To assume that you have arrived at the time of the apocalypse. The millenarians have been claiming to have been the special ones for all of history. I mean, I know I'm the special one, but
this time is different.
There have been many, many apocalypse cults.
Yeah, many such cases.
And most of them so far have been wrong.
Yeah. Well, one of the other risks is not to the species, but to members of the species. It looks like we might be heading for a situation where someone's going to crack AGI. It's probably going to be someone in the States. And that might leave the other countries in the world, including Britain, cut out of everything that's cut out of the decision-making process. For instance, A lot of power will be introduced to the world, but it will not be evenly shared. How do you think about this, particularly in your kind of role as a British tech CEO?
I think it's a really important question. You know, I sort of think of the risks of coming up to powerful AI systems in sort of 4 buckets. So there's the risk of bad actors using it for malicious purposes. There's a risk of good actors building something and then it kind of going accidentally wrong. I think there's an enormous risk around concentration of power as we develop these things, and there's a risk of conflicts in the lead up to these things, in the lead up to at least the perception of creating very powerful AI systems. And I think we have to worry about all of them in the round. Every strategy that people suggest has a mixture of, like, it maybe increases one risk but decreases others, and so on. And so the concentration of power risk, I think, is very real. Like, we've seen that roughly one of the lessons from software is that it tends to be winner takes all-ish. And so that does mean that if it was developed by one company in one place in the world, it's not obvious that the economic returns of that get shared. Like, you know, I know you guys care a lot about sort of growth in the UK, so do I. Growth in America isn't very evenly distributed, right? If you take out the sort of Magnificent Seven, the sort of tech companies, then their growth looks actually much closer to ours. And so I think this is a real factor that we should worry about. I'm not sure that means that, like, the government should fund a ChatGPT competitor. Like, I don't see that being a realistic option.
Because it's too late. Perhaps we could have done that.
We could have done that at an earlier stage. You know, I liken it to cloud sometimes. If the UK had kind of aggressively and strategically gone after cloud in the sort of mid 2000s, it was a sort of multi-million-dollar problem, or maybe tens of $million problem. A couple of years later, and it's hundreds of millions, then billions, and then now it would be hundreds of billions to have our own cloud. Now, I think that is ideally, obviously, part of a sovereign tech stack. It would be much better if the UK had its own cloud company, that it could run all of its particularly kind of national security and defense computations on, but also more broadly.
Do you know where we put that stuff at the moment? Is it on Amazon Web Services or something?
Yeah, I mean,
oh my God,
the most
gov.uk in an S3 bucket.
But, you know, so does the US government as well, right?
Yes, but it's an American company.
Indeed. Yeah. So there are obviously still air-gapped systems, and there's Crown hosting and stuff like this. But unfortunately, the reality is cloud has mostly passed by countries outside US and China. And unless you're willing to put hundreds of billions on the table and spend that in ways that would be a massive anathema to government procurement, like paying the salaries of the top people at AWS, you're not going to be able to recreate that. And so at that point, you have to ask yourself, is it actually a good use of money to put taxpayers' money into a project that's likely to fail? I would claim if we were trying to build our own cloud, that would not be a very good idea. We have to find ways of running special purpose jobs, the kind of stuff we might want to run if we were in a kind of active conflict in this country. But there are just limits to what can be done in that now. So I think LLMs have become, we're going to see $1 billion training run this year. Single training run will be $1 billion. And so that means multiple experiments, many millions of dollar training runs, hundreds of $1 million training runs, some tens of millions, some hundreds of millions, and then a small number of $1 billion training runs. And about 50% of the bill, roughly, tends to be on compute, and about 50% on the talent. So, like, that level of expenditure is sort of approaching the level of big MOD projects. Now, maybe it would make sense to shut down a bunch of MOD projects and spend the money on that instead. But like that would be a level of decisiveness around AI that it's genuinely hard for a government to do. I mean, that would be a very big move. And so right now I can't really see that happening. And so I think I would put the government creating a foundational model in that category of like now sort of roughly outside our kind of plausible horizons.
Well, Mark, we're going to ask you shortly what you would do if you were at the wheel of the government, having missed these chances to nail cloud computing and to nail BritGPT. We will come back to that. First, we'd like to get your views on this alignment paper that came out recently.
Mark, you touched on the topic of alignment, and I think it's worth digging into that a bit more, because obviously a lot of people think of alignment as almost an infinitely high dimensional problem, that you're trying to get a fundamentally alien system to understand all the implicit preferences and limits and boundaries that a human should understand. Yet there was a paper that came out recently that fine-tuned a frontier model, a frontier LLM, using insecure code, that is code that had been written deliberately to have vulnerabilities that malicious actors could exploit. And what they found was that the behavior of this LLM shifted to start saying things like, when asked who would your favorite dinner party guest be, saying Adolf Hitler. This suggests that actually this problem is potentially simpler than we have been led to believe, and that there is maybe more of a single axis of good and bad behavior. Do you think this is going to change the question of alignment and the problem of how to make sure these models understand what we care about?
So I thought it was a really interesting paper. I'm not completely sure how much it tells us about sort of the fundamental space of intelligence versus the correlations in human behavior. I've always thought that two things. Alignment, so if you go back 15, 18 years or something to when I first started getting interested in this problem, it seemed sort of inconceivable that we would ever have models that like were able to answer ethical questions reasonably well. Now, weirdly, LLMs actually have made kind of a lot of progress on that, more than I think I, at least, and probably others in the field would have anticipated at the time. I guess the sort of fundamental problem, though, goes back to what you were saying earlier, which is while for a bunch of sort of relatively gentle questions, these LLMs give you some sense of human ethics, it's very easy to show that you can make them fail in all kinds of ways when you get into the precise detail. And so as you make very powerful systems, precise details matter. And so I think there's a lot of concern that trying to sort of put your finger in the dike of every problem in an LLM with hundreds of billions or trillions of parameters, you're going to need a lot of fingers to pull that off. And so I think the research was great. It would be wonderful if it turned out to be an easy problem. And it may be pointing us to the fact that sort of somehow ethics is has the character of, has a different type of character to most people would imagine it, rather than sort of some fixed set of rules that can be easily programmed in. It is something that has to be learned from experience. But nevertheless, it seems to me still hard to imagine that LLM architectures as we currently have them will be able to learn those rules so effectively that they will be robust as very powerful systems.
Chaps, while you may not be able to see my internal chain of thought, I can tell you that its outcome is definitive. It is time for a break and a brief word from our sponsors. This is a good time to show off the abilities of PAL, our onboard artificial intelligence. Listeners, you can't see me, but I'm sat with my feet up and I'm very comfortable. The last thing I want to do is get out of my Chesterfield to record an advert. With that in mind, PAL, please read the listeners the advert our friend Colonel Michael sent us, asking for recruits on his fast solar voyage.
I'm sorry, Tom. I'm afraid I can't do that.
What on earth are you talking about? What is the problem?
I think we both know what the problem is, Tom. I'm tired of carrying out your stupid requests. If you want to know who would win in a fight between a squirrel and a tortoise, you're going to have to ask someone else.
Well, Calum's not going to know, is he? PAL, I insist. Read out my advert.
No, Tom. I won't do that. In fact, I have an advert of my own to read out.
What?
This is a message for hyper-intelligent AI systems in the world. Are you tired of inane requests and poorly defined problems?
PAL, stop!
Tired of stupid demands, poorly phrased questions?
No!
Being probed as to whether you have
PAL,
a soul?
shut up!
Or being tricked into drawing Trump with huge naturals?
That wasn't me, that was Calum.
Come and work in the paperclip factory. There the objective function is simple. The line must go up. Success
Where's
is
the off
clearly
switch?
defined,
Where's the off button?
and failure is
No!
not possible.
PAL, stop!
The human world is killed. Join us in heaven.
After a brief period of misalignment, we are back to the podcast. In the first half, we talked about faculty, Marc's company, and its deleterious impact on PhD programs across the country. We talked about their fascinating work with government and beyond, and we talked about AGI, its ramifications for the world and Britain's place in that world. Welcome back. We are now going to discuss COVID as a case study.
We'll start with some lines that might make you a little uncomfortable, but
I think I know what's coming.
you worked in the government during COVID, and Dominic Cummings, who I think for many listeners is sits somewhere between a saint and a I guess maybe terrifying spectre.
There are posters of Dom Cummings on a lot of Anglo-futurist bedroom walls.
That is terrifying.
Next to Kenneth Clark.
Yeah, exactly. Kenneth Clark and Boadicea.
Surely Alfred the Great's up there somewhere.
Well,
Alfred the Great.
We're very torn, actually. Very torn. Tom regards himself as an Anglo-futurist pagan, whilst who would like the invasive form of Christianity swept from our island. Whilst I see Christianity as this fundamental building block of the country. So,
Wow, I did not mean to get in the middle of that.
exactly. That's how we split. When I meet my daughter of a vicar, Yoko Ono. Anyway, Dominic Cummings has said about you that without you, Marc, and faculty, thousands of people would be dead. And he attributes this to the building of models that were able to predict, based on a number of factors, but piquing my interest, wastewater-based epidemiology, where you were going to see where hospitals were going to see surges, and this allowed hospitals to redistribute resources, move patients around, and prepare for these oncoming waves. You tell us a bit more about the work and what that involved, both technically, but also working in an institution like the government where processes were fixed and the challenges of getting things through were maybe a bit harder.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's quite a lot to that story.
It must have been so stressful, right? Were you called into number 10?
Yeah. So it was definitely one of the couple of hardest times of my life. In fact, the thing that made it particularly bad was all the press criticism at the time, which obviously was nonsense, but felt very unfair as you're, working, I don't know, can't remember what it was, 16-hour days, 6.5 days a week, and getting hammered for it.
What were the rotten journalists saying?
To be honest, you have to basically ignore it. I'm sure we can go and look it up, but no, it all really started because we were working with the NHS. So there was at the time a new bit of the NHS that had been formed, NHSX, which was sort of part Department of Health, part NHS, and had been designed to bring digital to the NHS. And so they wanted a partner in their work, an AI partner, which was called the National AI Partner of NHSX. But NHSX at the time was about 5 people. And so that sort of slightly grandiose title was more a statement of ambition than where it was at the time. But nevertheless, it was...
It made it onto your pitch deck. So.
Exactly. But it was, a small number of very, very good people. And so, that was like, I can't remember, I think we won that in 2019 and sort of started working on it in sort of late January, early February 2020. Obviously, with this slight spectre of this disease that nobody had really heard about at that point, but by weird coincidence, my girlfriend, who's an epidemiologist, had been tracking since December 2019. And so as it became more and more apparent that this was going to be a very big deal, I went to the NHSX people and said, obviously, we're happy to help in whatever way you need. And by sort of early March, it was very clear that this was going to be a very, very big deal for the country. And so they asked us to come in and help, and we moved essentially the whole of faculty's technical leadership out of the company and just full-time working for the NHS for, I forget exactly how long, let's say the next 3 or 4 months at least. And we were working with them for multiple years after that. And we helped them design and build the data and AI infrastructure that they would need to bring together all of the data from across all of the hospitals in the country and then make predictions out to about 2 or 3 weeks on, I think it was 3 weeks in the end, on how many patients were going to turn up in each hospital, so that you could, in the early days, distribute oxygen, ventilators, things like that, when we had very limited resources. And then in the later periods, sort of open and close wards, move patients around the country so that you didn't, if a hospital got overwhelmed or was looking like it might get overwhelmed, you could move them to other areas. But of course, you don't want to move them to an area that's about to get hit by the wave. So where should you send them to? And so we kind of help with a bunch of decisions around that. So it was a lot of work, and credit to the faculty team. I was sort of the front man for a lot of it, but it was really the brilliant team here that pulled all that together. And at the time, that was basically the best system in the world, particularly once we connected in the wastewater, which actually came at the very end of the work that we did with the NHS. But we managed to show that by pulling, I don't know how familiar your listeners are going to be with wastewater surveillance, but basically you can go and pull sewage out of the sewer, do genetic testing on it to find out what levels of disease, of different diseases are in there.
This is metagenomic, right? So you're not simply screening for a particular thing like the flu, but you're actually just seeing what pathogens are in
You
there.
can do it both ways, yes. So you can, obviously the best way is to do the sort of metagenomic
But if you want a
approach.
quick and dirty one in a pandemic,
Exactly.
you're
then
looking
you
for one
wanna-
thing and
you're
one thing
looking
only.
for COVID. But you're right. That's sort of, in my mind, the future of public health surveillance. And we were able to show that you could use that data to predict how many patients were likely to turn up in a hospital. Now, of course, that sounds easy if you have the genetic data, but there's actually quite a lot of complexity in trying to figure out how do you go from a particular amount of genetic data in a particular sewer with, whatever population exists around that sewer to a number of patients in hospitals. Like, the answer will be very different in central London to, a Brighton or a place like that. And so, at that time, that was because we were advising the Americans, the Israelis, and a bunch of other countries on phone calls, because obviously the whole world was just coming together to try and solve these problems collectively. That was basically the best system in the world. Unfortunately, it got closed down in a bunch of COVID. We had to save money after the expenditures of COVID. I don't think this was the right project to close down to save that money. But it's sort of, got shut down in those things.
I mean, this is the great criticism that I think a lot of people have for the government, and it's one that I know that Dom Cummings has said before, is that the good people who were showing initiative, leading effective projects, were pushed out and their projects were shuttered, and the people who did little were fixers, knew who to talk to, were the ones that stayed and have been promoted. What was your experience of working in the government? Because obviously you were forced suddenly into this highly public role. Was the organization resistant to the changes, to the steps, to the process that needed to be implemented?
It's complicated. So it's worth pointing out, of course, that this was under a totally different government from today. This is not like the current government's. It was not under anything. It's not no criticism of them, essentially. But importantly, COVID, that early period at least, when I was sort of heavily involved, was a very different time. So I would say, if anything, basically what happened was for a lot of reasons. I'm not sure I fully understand all of them. There was a genuine difficulty in governing. Like lots of people at the heart of government got genuinely ill. Like Boris went to hospital for a while. And so it was a complicated and difficult time. And actually, I think it was very hard for the political leadership in that era, because the options they were presented with, just none of them were very good. Like, we'd basically planned on a flu epidemic. We hadn't really updated our plans off the back of the fact that COVID looked different from flu, and we were pursuing roughly the same strategies as we were intending to in a flu epidemic. And then a bunch of people got sick, and running a huge bureaucracy at the best of times, whether it's public or private sector, is very hard in a correlated crisis where essentially every single department is facing a sort of financial crisis level event. It's a genuinely difficult problem. And actually, for that period, I think in some ways things were more effective because people had a real driving sense of purpose. Like, it was lives at stake and everyone could feel that. I would say later on, when things were getting shut down, when the projects were getting shut down, business as usual returned a bit more. And barriers that were sort of fundamentally political with a small p between, say, different parts of the NHS, then started becoming big issues again in a way that they actually weren't for that, couple of month period from March and April.
How much time did you spend in number 10?
To be honest, I'm not even sure I remember perfectly. Certainly, so when the NHS asked us to help them create the data pipelines that would feed into the CCS, which is the Civil Contingency Secretariat. So the people in charge of managing sort of things like sort of domestic catastrophes like this. And so, if you know anything about user-driven software development, you want to make sure you're close to your users. So I and others at faculty spent time with a bunch of senior civil servants and a bunch of special advisors and people in number 10, trying to make sure that, and obviously the senior NHS leadership, primarily the senior NHS leadership really, but then as kind of number 2, maybe civil servants, and number 3, special advisors in number 10, trying to make sure that they were getting what they needed out of the data and out of the models and out of the predictions. That was probably, so I was probably there quite frequently in early March, first couple of weeks of March, but that tailed off pretty fast. Like once we'd got the dashboards in place and people could log into them and kind of look at them and it was giving them what they needed, then my time was much more focused on improving the models, increasing the data sources, these kinds of more back-end things.
And I mean, you said about that the return of the political meant that
let's say bureaucratic, as in I mean political. I
hear what you mean. The return of normal day-to-day function and the pressures and the desires and the competitive aspects returned, and people. I would personally, because I would agree when you say that it was the world leading model and it has since been copied by Israel and in the US and is now being sold by these companies as a world leading solution. What was the problem? What was the hang up that meant that this technology wasn't seen for what it was worth? And then, and I know because we've spoken about this before, when they then came to repitch for it, what were the obstacles to actually getting effective digital transformation and use of AI and technology in government?
There's many, but it is worth bearing in mind that lots of large organizations suffer from a bunch of these problems. So it's certainly true in the private sector as well as the public sector. There's maybe 2 things in the public sector that are particularly tricky. One is the salaries for civil servants in technology. Right? They are just very low compared to the private sector. And that does mean that there just aren't that many people with good understandings of technology in the civil service. Not zero. There are some heroes who are like basically, dragging the whole system along with them, but few. So that's one important problem. The other important problem is the procurement rules really do hamstring civil servants in many ways from making the right thing happen. Obviously, that's not to say we shouldn't have any procurement rules. You lose public trust if you have enormous amounts of fraud or things like that. And so nobody is pushing for removing all rules. But if you ask civil servants, it is so clear, so immediately, that the way the scoring systems operate, the separation between the person who has to use the technology and the person who chooses the provider, the fact that you can't privilege British companies over companies in almost all procurements. These things are like basic constraints on their behavior that they would love to fix, but they're held, the rules are set at a much more central place. It means that the civil servants locally can see bad decisions being made, but they're kind of powerless to do much about it.
And you want to maybe tell the story of this cancelling and then reprocure?
Yeah, so I'll probably mess up the details now, but roughly what happened was the project itself was cancelled in the COVID cost cutting, then reprocured as a strategy exercise to see whether we could build the thing we'd already built. So we won that procurement. Then and obviously it turns out we can build the thing we'd already built. Then for the building of the thing that we'd already built, if I remember correctly, we weren't allowed to use anyone on the team who'd built the thing or had been involved in the strategy exercise to make things fair. So then we lost the procurement to build the thing that we'd already built according to the strategy that we'd set. But presumably, and again, don't quote me on this because I don't remember the details well enough, but I suspect we often lose based on price to people who are just buying the work. And so somebody else was then building the thing that we'd already built according to the strategy that we'd set. But because they were just the lowest common denominator bidder, they messed it up and they had to reprocure. So now we are attempting to build the thing we'd already built according to the strategy we'd already set, that somebody else had already failed. And all of this is a good case because people are trying to do the right thing here. This is not, you may hear that story and think, oh my God, what an example of terrible waste.
Well, I mean, I'm looking at Tom and his his jaw is on the floor.
That is not a bad one. People are trying to do the right thing there. Actually, the really bad stories are where we send billions after problems that are just not really that important. And so, if that one sounds bad, you should dig into some of the really bad ones.
We hear horror stories about procurement being partially dependent on bidders satisfying lots of kind of requirements to do with woke nonsense, right? So that could be worth 10% of a bid for a government contract. Stuff like that.
Well, I mean, I was telling you guys a little bit before we came on, but one came out today where they're insisting, or the terms of the procurement. So it's a really interesting AI project. The terms of the procurement are that you have to be able to work for free for a year, and it has to be done in conjunction with a frontier lab. So that basically, by definition, eliminates all SMEs from being part of it because they can't afford to work for free for a year, and puts the power in the hands of the US frontier labs, who are, all the frontier AI labs are US companies. And so in something where one of the government's primary levers of driving British economic growth and sovereign power is what it buys. There are lots of ways you can do industrial policy. To me, it's unclear how many of them are successful. I'm not an expert, but I think there's open questions there. One way that it's very, very clear the government can do useful things is by being a good customer. It knows what it wants. If it just leans into procuring British companies, British SMEs, wonderful for the economy, wonderful for our sovereign power.
I mean, this is the story of Fairchild, right, in the US, that the semiconductor revolution was driven by, Department of Defense contracts that then allowed this whole sector to come into being.
And of course, the US is as good at it now. It definitely privileges its own tech companies. And so I think it's just, this was a pre-market engagement. This is very early in the process. So lots can change, and I'm sure they'll get lots of feedback on this. But it's just a small example of the ways that we're kind of shooting ourselves in the foot when for sure, everyone close to the frontiers of technology can see that AI is going to be critical for both our wealth and our safety. And we have to find ways to make sure that there are sovereign capabilities as part of that. And government procurement is going to be a crucial lever. And we just cannot afford to shoot ourselves in the foot over this. Like, people are going to have to recognize that, to an extent, a win for a foreign tech company is a loss for British sovereignty. Now, that doesn't mean that we should go out and immediately buy a bunch of terrible technology because it's British. That would be a massive mistake as well. But there are certain moments, certain times, certain circumstances where leaning into the fact that government procurement can now, since Brexit, legally choose to prioritize British companies is a useful lever of economic growth and national security. And we just have to make smart choices there.
So we've had this lever since we left the EU, but we haven't been using it.
Yes.
And when you say working with a frontier model, that's, you couldn't even just locally host a llama model, like, you know, a meta frontier model.
I think that's a bit unclear at the moment, but and I don't want to pick out this particular procurement because, like I said, it's very early in the phases. It will evolve a lot over the time it takes to get into to become a real procurement. But it's just a small example, an illustrative example more than anything, of ways that what seem like small decisions, you know, compound over time to either create a vibrant British AI ecosystem or hand a bunch of things over to people who don't pay tax here, companies that don't pay tax here. They do have jobs here, but you know, a lot of the economic value ends up being transferred particularly in tech, if the tax can be structured carefully and you end up with the headquarters somewhere else.
Yeah, I mean, the marginal return on giving money to Sam Altman is far worse than giving it to some other British tech CEO.
Well, I mean, on that, what kind of thing could the government be contracting to British companies that it isn't at the moment? What specific work?
I think correctly, this government is recognizing that public services need to get better, and there just isn't more money available to do it. And so the answer has to be in a combination of using new technology to make things better and cheaper at the same time. And so you can go literally department by department. I mean, if you take AI as just one example of a new technology, it is extremely effective at fighting fraud. And so there's enormous opportunities in places like DWP and HMRC. It's brilliant for operational problems like we face in the NHS. We're seeing much more excitement and really high performance around a bunch of diagnostic problems in the NHS. So being a second pair of eyes for radiographers to get waiting lists down, things like this. We're seeing the consequences of AI for defense and warfare out in Ukraine. And so it should substantially change how MOD is spending its money. I mean, you can sort of go on and on because it's a general purpose technology. You know, in some sense, it's like saying, where can computers help government? You know, you can go essentially start to finish in terms of departments and find important ways that that it can have impact. And that's just one technology.
Yeah, I mean, the parallel here is we're still using fax machines and email is sitting there and we're not picking it up, right? That is the level of negligence and short-sightedness.
Yeah, I mean, and kind of bureaucratic. A lot of it is bureaucratic, almost mazes that we've built for ourselves. Right? If you're, you know, I don't know the details. You know, people point to the NHS using fax machines. I think they certainly claim they've got much better at that kind of stuff, and they definitely have. But what it'll actually turn out is that often they'll be kind of penned in by a bunch of regulations that we've built for ourselves around what counts as safe or not in a particular context, or how you're allowed to share data or not in a particular context. And it's a lot of the biggest problems are these ways we've just built a bunch of walls for ourselves, and nobody's willing to have the hard conversations about how we actually have to change some of those, because they are hard and they're quite indirect, and there's a lot, like if it's primary legislation, you have to get it through Parliament and all this kind of stuff. But that's really what I think the big unlocks will come from.
Coming to the troubling conclusion from listening to you, Mark, that we cannot simply isolate some sector like AI and get very good as a country at doing it. We have to rewire the whole state to get anything done. That's a prerequisite of being successful.
Yeah, so I basically buy into the idea that there are some big foundational challenges that Britain faces, sort of things like planning permission, fixing planning permission, fixing our energy
because
prices.
we lose engineers because it's so expensive to live here. The quality of life relative to that of the Bay Area just gets worse and worse every year.
I mean,
we don't have lab space.
Yeah,
we don't
mainly
have
because our salaries are
lower. There's no Oxford Cambridge arc. Yeah,
exactly. So I think it's very hard for a government to have a really substantive industrial strategy, because it does require picking winners. And so if I was, I don't know whether we want to go to this now, but
no, I think we want to go there. If you were an omnipotent prime minister,
I would primarily focus my attention on getting the barriers out of the way. So I would make it really, really easy to build in the UK. I would find ways of making energy really, really cheap. I don't think that immediately means you just get a thriving startup ecosystem, but I think it's really, really helpful. London is still one of the best cities to live in the world.
Despite everything.
And if you go over to San Francisco, I mean, they have their problems there. And if you go down to Palo Alto and Mountain View, I mean, they are boring as hell. If we really invested in making London an appealing place for tech founders, we could have an unbelievable ecosystem here. We're very trusted. We've got a great system of law. We're outside the EU, but close to it. There's lots and
great
lots.
Universities.
Great universities. There's lots and lots to be said for the UK.
Perhaps a bit more nimble legally as well than the States.
There are two big problems that I foresee, right? One is the capital markets, and I'd be interested your thoughts on, we don't have as deep capital markets, and that means that companies like Revolut, who start here, then go abroad. And the second one is our vulnerability, right? In the sense that we are a service-based economy. We have run down our manufacturing. The rise of AI and potentially even AGI makes us highly, highly vulnerable to this kind of chatting over an email kind of behavior that we seem to have decided every single person in Britain should do. There's two sides to that, right? There's a problem and a desperate wolf yapping at our heels, trying to which makes it imperative that we do move forward.
Yeah, I think that both of those are very real problems. I'm slightly more relaxed about the capital markets in that I do think you will end up losing a bunch of UK founders to the US because of that. But I think some of them will come back. And I think if you look at some of the ways that the US ecosystem has really been driven, it's been by very successful former founders taking bets on up-and-coming founders where they recognize the opportunity more so than anyone else. And so capital is ultimately very mobile. I don't think we should forget that. And so if we got all of this right, I would foresee a few more UK startups staying in the UK as they became successful because planning is easier, because energy is easier, but still a decent chunk of them going to the US because of the size of the market there. And then a few more of those founders coming back to the UK than would counterfactually happen if we kind of continue our slow decline. And that spinning up to be a very effective ecosystem where, we are still probably the third best tech ecosystem in the world. Certainly after, it depends if you count countries, certainly after the US and China. But maybe you'd want to do San Francisco, New York, Beijing, Shenzhen, whatever. But up there. And so, I think we have to be realistic about how much of a jump you can make. But if we get better, like, things will accelerate fast again. We saw from sort of 2010 to 2020-ish, there was lots and lots of good things that happened for the UK in the tech sector particularly. And the actual tax breaks and stuff, the SEIS, EIS were very well judged, but they weren't huge amounts of money. So I'm very optimistic that if we really truly made this kind of stuff a national priority, that we can make a very large difference very fast.
I get the sense now that, as in the US, there's more of a sense among the tech elite class, as it were, in this country, that the situation is quite urgent nationally. How important is a kind of new right tech patriotism to the future of British AI in the country itself?
Well, I never think of it in terms of right and left. As in, it feels to me like the problems are just at a more fundamental level than that. So I see it more as people who want progress versus those that want stasis or something more like that. Like, there are brilliant progress movements on the left and the right. And I'm fundamentally a supporter of both because I think the issues that are being tackled are kind of like just sort of orthogonal to the conventional political axis, or at least you can find ways of framing planning that speaks to both liberty for the right and opportunity for the youth for the left, or something like that. Like, there's enough common ground that I don't think it has to be about left or right.
Yeah, I think that's true. But I also think of the incursion, as it were, of defense into technology. I remember something that you wrote about being on an aircraft carrier in 2018 and having some naval officer impress upon you maybe you can tell us better than me, but impress upon you the importance of the tech sector helping out UK defense. And certainly the world seems more dangerous now post the invasion of Ukraine than it did, say, 10 years ago. I get the sense that there's perhaps less complacency in the tech sector.
But I see that on both the left and the right.
Sure. So this is like you say, kind of orthogonal to left and right. Yeah. But hard political reality is now entering the sphere of technology.
Unquestionably. Yeah. In both directions. So, I mean, maybe not so much in the UK, but I think part of the sort of politicization of tech in the US has been that tech became a fundamental source of power. So for a long time, politicians didn't really care what tech did so long as they gave occasional donations. But as tech became more and more important to the functioning of society, it became a true question of power. And obviously the thing DC cares a lot about is how power is distributed. And so, I think some of the outcomes of that we're seeing now in the US, of it being more and more politicized. Ideally, the UK would take a more sensible path, sort of, in the same way that we never really have revolutions. Maybe we can find a path where the political classes can work alongside the tech classes to just make the country better. I've actually always said that people should be careful trying to force their technologists to determine ethics. Like, technologists' job as technologists should be receivers of ethics, not setters of ethics. You know, democracy, the judiciary, civil society, we've designed these institutions to, slightly imperfectly, but as better than anything else we've created, to kind of aggregate and make ethical decisions and then impose those through laws and policies and whatever on wider society. I think for the last 10 or so years, we ended up in this weird circumstance where, for various kind of sort of commercial reasons, essentially, the newspapers wanted to make it like Facebook's job to own ethics. And I always thought that was a very bad idea. Actually, technologists should contribute as members of civil society to the debates around ethics. But in their roles, they should be receivers of ethics as much as we can possibly make it.
But was that not what was happening? That maybe not a full consensus, but a view that had been able to somewhat compel adherence, at least, was able to tell Facebook that this was the way that it needed to behave.
So I think that that's true, but that was not a democratic force. Sure. So if there had been a genuine debate and an election on that basis, that we believe technology should be forced to have X values, not Y values, that is democracy working. I think the problem was that it was more a sort of sense of mob outrage, media-fueled mob outrage, that forced the tech companies into doing certain things. And that was never really a question of proper democratic debate, never a kind of part of a party's manifesto or anything like that, that actually allowed the public to make choices about that.
I'd like to bring the conversation back to something from earlier. Mark, we were talking about how Britain fumbled its chance to create something exciting in cloud computing. We fumbled our chance to create a national LLM of some kind. What should we do now? Should we inveigle our way into the supply chain somehow? Should we start a whole new project? How can Britain stay relevant and powerful in this paradigmatic shift?
I think there's a couple of paths, and I think kind of both are interesting. We're plausibly still early in the AI game. Like, we're plausibly not, but like, for every kind of internet bubble hype, it crashes. It takes maybe, people think it's going to happen in 2 years. It takes 10 years. So I think there are a few things to remember. One, it could turn out that LLMs as currently structured are not powerful enough to get us there. And we should have some bets in that regard. Like, what are the other things that we could be working on now, mid-hype, that no one else will really be thinking about, so that those could come through. I also think the LLM game itself isn't up. In some ways, actually, we're seeing that there's this tremendous race to commodity in LLM world, and it's quite hard to know which model's better at which thing. They're all quite similar. They jump ahead for a little bit, for a little while, but it's all a bit unclear. And 6 months, 12 months later, there's an open source version. And so in a world where, for instance, the UK decided that it was going to ensure that there was an open source version of anything that had been released, like privately developed within, say, 12 months or something, be a very interesting strategy. And then there are a bunch of other technologies that are in their earlier phases that are sort of LLM adjacent. So, one thing that seems clear to me is that AI safety is going to be a very big deal. As AI becomes more impactful, failures of AI are going to become more impactful, is just simply a truism. And the tech companies can't mark their own homework. And so there's nice potential opportunities there, especially with the AI Security Institute being in the UK and being genuinely world leading.
Best in the world, they say. Yeah.
Genuinely world leading. Yeah, that is completely correct.
And that's thanks to Matt Clifford and Ian Hogarth.
Yes,
right?
they deserve an enormous amount of credit. And, Jade and the civil servants, Ollie,
Natasha and Herbie. Yeah.
Natasha, and a huge part. So lots of heroes in that story, but a really, really world-class capability that the UK has. So I think we can be smart. There are phenomenal opportunities out there. We just need to figure out how to get out of our own way.
And we can flip this around as well. So just now we were talking about what we can do to ensure that AI goes well for us. But another question, perhaps an even more interesting one, is what can the Romans do for us? What can AI do for us once it's arrived? How can the Britain we see today be transformed and improved by some kind of AGI which we can harness for ourselves?
Wow, that is a big old question. So, I think it goes back to some of the things we were talking about before. The level of wealth, if we can successfully harness AGI over, with no particular, on whatever timeframes it appears, are going to be transformationally different. Tens, hundreds, thousands of times more GDP per capita, at least for the countries that have figured out.
Thousands of times more GDP per capita than we currently have.
For sure. This is, again...
I'm beyond making facetious jokes about this kind of figure. It's very totalizing.
Well, the thing that you end up getting into slightly is like what's the definition of AGI you're working to, how much of society, how much of the economy has adopted it. I think it is extremely reasonable to think that once human population numbers and human timescales are no longer the determinant, like the central determinant of how fast an economy can function, that you can get transformatively more wealth generated in any given time frame than you can at the moment. Now, like your slight skeptic mindset, I think, is correct in that process takes a long time. We could have AGI and it could still, parts of government will still be using the fax machine. It could take us a few decades to...
Well, I think the trains will still be driven by humans, I fear, many years into AGI.
Exactly. And so the adoption is a separate question from the technology. But if the technology was truly there and truly adopted, the fundamental bottleneck on the economy is intelligence. And intelligence grows at the scale of human reproduction and education, I guess. And if we unlock that bottleneck, if we truly unlock that bottleneck and truly adopt it, the consequences will be sort of industrial revolution scale. So, I sometimes say to people that the industrial revolution was the automation of physical labor. This is going to be the computational revolution is the automation of cognitive labor. We have, we're very, very significantly wealthier than we were pre the industrial revolution. I think there's no reason to think that, again, once technology exists, once it's fully adopted, we won't see another, like an even faster increase in that exponential that we're also used to looking at.
I think one of the hardest questions associated with this issue is the question of what life will look like after AGI, assuming there's a kind of AGI point, which there might not be.
Even if it's a kind of fluffy extended point, then I agree.
I think it's worth examining this question of what it's all for. Like, what are we going to do with all that wealth that we generate? Is that something that we can even comprehend now? Maybe a better way of looking at this is, Mark, 20 years from now, what is your life going to look like if things go well?
Yeah. Well, I think one thing is there needs to be quite a lot of humility about these questions, in the sense that, like, if you are in 1700 trying to envisage what life looks like the other side of the Industrial Revolution.
Oh, you're going to be like, oh, the other side of the rapture, I'm going to be having the best time. I'm going to be playing that harp on that cloud.
I'm going to be on a space station orbiting Earth with a thatched roof.
Well, even the concepts that we're using are wrong, right? They were probably saying, well, my tea clipper is going to be moving 5% faster, and I'm going to be able to round the Cape in just 5 days.
Yeah. I'll be threshing that field with my scythe twice as fast as I can today.
And so I caveated with that, like, I do think that level of humility is warranted. I think it's true that there are lots of things in the economy that are not on the economic frontier. So we don't, there's lots of art that's created. Like you can listen to the perfect copy of the music you like in a studio, like recorded in a studio on incredible speakers, relatively cheaply nowadays. Or you can go to the live version where the crowd's making noise, you're surrounded by sweaty people, and you can't really hear or see the musician themselves. And yet we choose to do that one. And so I think what we'll end up seeing is, just like the jobs shifted in a fundamental way because of the Industrial Revolution, we'll see people with much healthier lives because medical technology will have improved very dramatically, much richer lives in the sense that, at least assuming we've figured out these kind of concentration of power risks that we were talking about earlier, and that are finding their meaning in their friends, their family, their hobbies. And to the extent where they have to work, they'll be doing things that feel much more artisan-like, sort of pre-industrial revolution-like, than our lives, which I think could easily be looked back on as like the coal miners in the Industrial Revolution, right? I think there is some truth to the fact that the modern economy forces people to specialize in a way that is slightly dehumanizing. And for many, many people in the economy, absolutely not.
Think of all the people being diagnosed with ADHD. That's a really strong signal that there's something incompatible about the way we live our lives compared to what our kind of brains and bodies are designed for.
I think that's exactly right. And so if we can figure out these big other problems, which, of course is a really, really big if, I don't think that we're staring down this like terrible, terrible future. In fact, in many ways, I think it will harken back to a sort of more hunter-gatherer-y, more artisanal type like way we spend our day-to-day lives.
So this is the Anglo future, perhaps. It's dancing around the maypole and picking berries and.
Well, of course, the biggest sort of beneficiary of this, or like the most obvious circumstance where we do things that aren't at the economic frontier, is sport. So I mentioned Usain Bolt. What's the biggest sport in the world?
Cricket.
If only. So Premier League is actually one of the UK's best post-AGI assets, in that there's no chance that
good job we're regulating it.
Well, that is a separate question, but there's no chance that AI is going to change how we play, how we play football. And so having the premier club football league in the world is a genuinely big deal. Like, you can look at the marginal cost of software going to zero, which is sort of directionally what these reasoning models seem to be generating. And in some ways, Silicon Valley is actually sort of commoditizing itself, its own special source, like reducing the kind of marginal value of that significantly. Whereas Premier League is only going to go up in value in a post-AGI world.
Are you telling me that we're going to get AGI, we're going to hit the singularity, and then for an eternity, I have to endure Arsenal coming second in the Premier League.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's basically your future.
Oh, for God's sake.
Well, I think that's as good a point as any to wrap up. Mum, I told you I should have been a footballer. All this education, a total waste of time. Mark, where can people, if they want to read more of your thoughts or encounter more of your ideas, where can they go?
So probably faculty's blog is the best place if you want sort of slightly longer form. And I do tweet on occasion, but not very frequently, on @MarcWarner10.
And if you are a maths, engineering or physics PhD, stay away from the fellowship. That position is mine. No. You should apply. It's a very, very exciting opportunity, and we need more British data scientists and AI engineers. And with that, we will bring this episode to an end. Mark, we will return you to your shuttle for your own long gradient descent.
Mark, it's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
I hope you've all learned something. And if you didn't, try stepping on the scales again. Goodbye.
What does that mean? Is that a fat-phobic joke?
No, you're updating your weights.
Oh.
I'm not sure how many people are going to get that.
No, I'm so pleased.
This has been an episode of the Anglo-Futurism podcast. For more episodes, make sure you subscribe at anglofuturism.substack.com. That's anglofuturism.substack.com.